So, oddly enough, the rare pamphlet that I wanted to research and needed to research for this book chapter I'm endeavoring to put together is housed at the library on campus where my daughter happens to just now be attending college. Who knew? Who also knew it would be this valuable? I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like. So, The Fraud of Black Capitalism by Dick Roberts, 1970, Pathfinder Press. Famous or infamous to some for all of its publications of Malcolm X speeches under George Brightman in the 80s, is of great value for a number of key reasons, not the least of which is that it starts off by pointing out that all of the efforts, that many of the mainstream efforts to address the material inequality facing Black people in the United States was forcibly subsumed to using modern market instruments. Now, this is a quote from Core's Harlem effort at the time, not meaning it in this way, but this is what one of Roberts's points and why he starts off this pamphlet by looking at some of these more, at the time, recent efforts to address the condition, but all of them forcibly accepting or being subsumed beneath the modern market instruments of capitalism. Citing the legendary work from the now late great Robert Allen, Black Awakening in Capitalist America. He quickly, that is, Robert situates the problem again as being one subsumed within this broader apparatus of white corporate capitalism, and one where capitalism and and its white corporate overseers are very happy to have Black people engage in Black capitalist endeavor because it forces them within that system and that logic, and that is something that is easily both observed and limited. This pamphlet does also a great job of quickly summarizing from the perspective of the political and economic white elite of the time and some Black critics why Black capitalism can never work, because it is, as we've argued here quite often in a variety of ways, all of the avenues through wealth creation and capitalism have been monopolized and accumulated in the handful of a tiny few white corporate elite. Whether it's venture capital investment, access to viable consumer markets, or whatever, Black people are cut off from that. Allen, of course, situated it within more of an internal colonialism. This pamphlet is clearly situating it within the anti-capitalist logic of socialism. But either way, the point remains the same and is accurately assessed at either perspective. Black people are cut off from whatever would produce wealth within a capitalist economy. And then the question is raised in this pamphlet as well as to whether or not anyone should be looking to accumulate wealth within this capitalist economy. Central to my own argument around the narrative rise of Black capitalism post-Second World War is the point being made here that folks like Roy Innis, more conservative members of the civil rights establishment, started promoting Black capitalism under the sponsorship of elite institutions, the Ford Foundation, not the least among them, but that this flies in the face of what is understood about capitalism, that as Roberts writes here, capitalist America cannot contemplate functioning without this type of labor. That is a suppressed Black worker class at the bottom rung, that without that and others forming that bottom rung of the working class, oppressed as it is, capitalism can't function. So the idea that Black capitalism can evolve Black people out of that rung is part of the fantasy being exposed here, or the fraud rather being exposed here by Roberts. And here, just to quickly summarize what Roberts is saying in this part of the pamphlet, he makes a very interesting point about following the logic of what it means to have Black people assume the businesses in their communities that are themselves targeting a low income, low wage consumer base, that are themselves reliant upon products and goods and services of the broader capitalist and imperialist structure, going all the way to the so-called third world to extract natural resources to turn them into materials and products that can be commodified and put into the market, all controlled by the larger white capitalist apparatus that the Black business is at the tail end of. So raising that question of, well, two-pronged point or question around what could be expected to evolve materially out of that business arrangement, and then Are we arguing that it's a good thing that Black people become part of this exploitative relationship, even if a handful of Black business people benefit in the end? Here, again, specific to my own focus, Roberts is talking about how the broader business elite and community is happy to have Black people engage in these Black capitalist fantasies because it's understood that they can never upset the relationship of capital to society or the community, and they cannot upset the relationship or the accumulation of that capital in the hands of a tiny few white business elite. And how for them, using the example of the Xerox company, it becomes, as he writes here, a public relations operation of these giant corporations. And by today, certainly since post George Floyd's killing, we've seen this exponentially imposed, where the corporate world is feeding this idea, funding it with billions of dollars to promote this idea. And of course, the funding going to financial literacy training, small business development, et cetera, and so forth, all with the idea that this is good propaganda, public relations, that it makes it seem like the corporate world has some concern for the plight of black people, but it's clearly tying them to the bottom rungs again of that capitalist structure, that global international imperialist capitalist structure, whereby with the point here, this at the time described militant Black organization in Rochester, New York, Fight, Freedom, Integration, God, Honor Today, becomes a subsidiary in effect, making very little money relatively from the Xerox company, producing electrical transformers and metal stampings. So again, much to my own point, and said perfectly well here by a return to look at Robert Allen's work, even though there's a critique here of it, which I'll quickly explain in a second. But the point here is that Allen says, I think quite rightly, that Black people cannot afford a system which organizes community resources and then distributes the resulting wealth in a hierarchical fashion, with those who need least getting most. Neither can Black people afford some half-hearted compromise which would make the Black community in general and its educated classes in particular subservient to the expansionist needs of corporate capitalism. Of course, capital must be accumulated to make possible the economic development of the Black community, but this must be done in a way that precludes the enrichment of one class at the expense of those below it. End quote. Now, as you see here, Du Bois is mentioned in terms of his relationship to a cooperative commonwealth. This is brought up quickly as a slight critique of what Allen was saying there, specifically this point about capital must be accumulated to make possible economic development. And Roberts, as a socialist, is arguing, as we'll come to in a moment, something different, suggesting that Du Bois's approach to cooperative commonwealth, the cooperative commonwealth, is the step forward. I'm going to come back in another video, another short video, to talk about Du Bois and cooperative. So I'm not going to get into this right now, but why this point is flawed. And we'll come to that shortly with a focus on Du Bois himself. Again, in a separate video, I should say, focus on Du Bois himself. Suffice it here to say that what I do agree with Robert Allen is that Black people cannot afford a system that just simply redistributes wealth to a handful and hierarchically while leaving those who need it the most below at the bottom. I do agree, though, with Roberts that there needs to be a different approach to accumulating wealth and even defining what wealth is. So Roberts concludes here with a point that we've raised elsewhere regarding the myth around buying power in Black capitalism more broadly, and one that I've really come to want to promote, that I'm finding that Bayard Rustin made, despite all of his contradictions. I agree with him on this one. Baldwin made it. A few others have made it. And the point variously made is that Black people being encouraged to focus on Black capitalism in whatever variant are being drawn away from what is their real potential power, that is, as a labor force, as a class. Instead of, as I argue with buying power, stop focusing on this fantasy of whatever 1 point whatever trillion and focus on the actual wealth being created for those who own the economy, that is 20 plus trillions of dollars every year. Same with the argument around, instead of encouraging Black people to focus on starting some small business, the focus should be on the power that we actually already have, which is as organized labor. So that's why Roberts is asking here that instead of looking to get into some sort of the business process lane, that imperial process of raw material production into mass commodity production and marketing, Roberts asks here, contrast the various schemes of advancing Black business with the potential power that Black workers possess if they organize to use it politically. Which, of course, for me is...
Now listen, that's called my boy. You know nothing about that.
Let's focus more on what happens in terms of outcome with the wealth we're already producing and less on trying to get in at the point of so-called opportunity in the production of that wealth. That's not where the answer is. Now, also, just very quickly, having covered the fraud of Black capitalism, I did come across this great short book chapter from a text on African Americans in the US economy textbook of some years ago that I had just not ever paid too much attention to because it wasn't the focus of anything I was doing in particular at the time. It now is, and Manning Marable has offered up a couple of gems here. So again, as a short chapter in African Americans in the US economy, Manning Marable wrote this history of Black capitalism, which makes a couple of very key points for me in this most recent attempt at work that I'm doing now. First of all, he starts off making the broad point that is very helpful to me and to making this to clarifying the time frame here. The origins of Black capitalism are found in the development of a small but affluent propertied Black elite which emerged before the Civil War. And the short of it is, within the so-called slave economy, some Black people had found a business relationship with their masters and the broader white society, where they could be largely left alone and allowed to become relatively fruitful as long as they did particular services and labor. Even if they were allowed to start, even when they were allowed to start their own businesses, that labor and those businesses were meant to satisfy that white master class and the surrounding white community. So as Marable writes here, the older Black business elite, barbers, butlers, caterers, tailors, blacksmiths, carpenters, furniture makers, and other skilled artisans had been dependent on white patrons for much, if not all, of its business. With the expansion of racial segregation after 1890, many of these artisans disappeared. The new generation of Black entrepreneurs was a byproduct of racial segregation, developing goods and services for Black consumers, embracing Washington's, that is Booker T's, rhetoric of self-help and racial upliftment. A conservative Black nationalist ideology was promoted aggressively by Black bankers, insurance agents, and small merchants precisely because they depended upon the Negro community for their support, observed historian August Meyer. And this is at the crux of the problem to this day, that what is promoted as a radical militant Black revolutionary solution to the material conditions of Black people in the United States is coming from a conservative Black nationalist ideology, often led by Black bankers, insurance agencies, and small merchants. They are themselves carrying the logic of capitalism and Black capitalism, which is itself very white, very anti-Black, and very conservative. Key to my point also, as Marable writes here, much of the sudden growth of Black business could not have occurred without the critical assistance of the Black press. And again, using my language, this is the origins of that incestuous relationship which thrives to this day, where Black commercial media requires white advertising dollars to promote a false economic reality to Black people and to the world, suggesting that Black entrepreneurialism, business, commercialism will be a solution. Much like Abram Harris before him, Manning Marable starts talking about the evolution of the "don't buy where you can't work" argument, that buy Black, bank Black, the Black capitalist solution to the Negro's plight, as he writes here, all of it emerging in the early 20th century and developing an aspirational Black petty bourgeoisie or Black capitalist class that profited, as Marable writes here, from racial discontent. And it's a similar argument that I and others around here have been making for a long time, that the goal is to redirect Black anger and militancy into a very safely commercial capitalist logic and structure that can easily be mediated and suppressed and mitigated so as to not become a problem for actual capital. Again, helping my own argument, Marable points out that a lot of this took off around the 1950s and 60s, post-World War II, where Black capitalism, the prospects of it began to improve. That's where you see the rise of the selling the Negro argument from John H. Johnson that we've talked about, and the evolution of the modern form of the problem. Again, Marable says that the Black business community has the same several common characteristics, all of which revolve around the problems we've talked about here: lack of access to capital, targeting a consumer base that has no money, being relegated to the lower rungs of the economy, human services and retail, having very few employees, often employing themselves, and so on and so on and so forth. That is the exact same problem that persists to this day. Marable ends this chapter by really hammering in on the point that I've been wanting to make and then focused on in this chapter myself, that a major obstacle to present day Black capitalist strategy is the newly found interest of white corporations in controlling and capturing the Black consumer market. So whether it's Nielsen and the conscious consumer or whatever else we've been talking about around here for several years now, there is no competing. There is no starting point from which Black businesses can emerge and catch up. And when the white corporate world, which already is itself monopolized, which already is itself accumulated in terms of wealth and access to the higher echelons of business and manufacturing, et cetera, white businesses can't compete with white businesses. So when they want to get involved in capturing the Black consumer market, Black businesses targeting that same consumer market are not going to be able to compete. They can't produce as much. They can't produce as much as fast. They can't produce as much marketing. They can't flood their own ads in their own media spaces or Black targeting media spaces as much as whites, which is why we see Roland Martin and others constantly targeting big white corporations and calling them out for not feeding enough money to the Black commercial media community. That's what's going on here. And then finally, as he concludes the chapter, the civil rights movement and desegregation permitted the white private sector to develop a variety of advertising strategies to extract billions in profits from Black consumers, all in the name of equality. The net result was the increased marginalization of the Black entrepreneur, the manipulation of Black culture and social habits by white corporations, and a new kind of economic underdevelopment for all Blacks at all economic levels. Thanks, everybody. Just a quick look at both the history and fraud of Black capitalism. Obviously, much more to come around here on this topic and issue. Do all of the things. And as always, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And I'll catch you next time right here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.